All right, and now that we're recording, I do want to welcome you all to my book discussion. Um, Let me share my screen with you. I did prepare a few slides, but I'm really hoping that we will talk more about the questions that you might have or things you want to bring up about assessment. Actually, before we dive in, can I ask you all to maybe introduce yourselves because we are a small group. And if you could talk a little bit about your experience with assessment, that would be helpful, and that would certainly help me. So maybe we can just go around. Let me just open this so I can see this all. Here we go. And let me get our hang on, I see this covering it up. So we're going to slideshow. Two people in the waiting room. Let me let them in. All right, and slideshow. There we go, from the beginning. But anyway, I was hoping if I could get you to introduce yourselves, then I would have an idea of who is present today. So could we start with Beth Ann?
Hi, I'm Beth Ann Drinker. I'm the lead literacy teacher at Chester Andover Elementary School in Chester, Vermont. My position is a K-6 position. I'm not a coach. I'm not an interventionist, but I do both of those things. Most of my reading assessment work is actually at the tier 1 level, but I work with the interventionists and the special educators as well.
Okay, well, welcome, Beth Ann. Do you do any assessment yourself?
So I'm in charge of doing all the DIBELS assessments in our booth. And then sometimes I'll do some of the diagnostic assessments based on what we're seeing in the classroom and what we're seeing on DIBELS.
Okay, well, welcome. Welcome. How about Megan Martin? Hi, Megan.
Hello, how are you? I'm Megan Martin. I'm in St. Charles, Illinois. I am a speech language pathologist and a certified structured literacy dyslexia specialist. So I like to work with the kiddos one-on-one. I was in a school district for 17 years as the lead SLP, and we had FastBridge, so we did all of those assessments, as well as all of my speech language assessing. And now I work for the AIM Institute, but I love and I love your book. So when I saw this, I joined. So I'm excited to be here. I'm glad you're recording because I do have to hop off early for a work meeting, but I'm excited. So that's me.
Okay, well, welcome, Megan. Marion.
Hi, my name's Marion Bach. For the past 5 years, I've been a special educator at Coventry Village School. Before that, I lived in Massachusetts and I taught at the Carroll School, which is a school that specializes in students who have dyslexia. So there, I wasn't really assessing, except for classroom stuff, but obviously reading a lot of reports. And now, I've started doing more assessments. I did the FAR recently, and actually was just working on training on the FAR today, the writing assessment. Yeah, that's about it.
Well, welcome. I've been to the Carroll School, not for many years, but my work used to take me down there on occasion.
Oh, good.
Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Appolito. I am the director of curriculum at Winooski Schools in Winooski, Vermont.
Great.
And I don't do any of the assessments, but I work very closely with the teachers who do. I help teachers interpret the results of the assessments and sort of help us keep focused on which assessments we're doing and what we're not.
Well, welcome. Diana?
Hi, Diana Murray. I'm a special education teacher in Show, Arizona.
Hi.
And don't think Phoenix, don't think Tucson. We're actually in the White Mountains of Arizona. And we are in the middle of a winter storm warning and expecting anywhere from 5 to 10 inches of snow tonight.
Wow.
Yeah, I currently work as a special education teacher. I've been in this position for 6 years and spent 10 years prior in Grand Junction, Colorado. I did my master's degree at Fitchburg State in reading disabilities because we spent several years in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So I currently, like I said, I'm a special education teacher for grades kindergarten through 3rd. So I do a lot of progress monitoring. I do obviously the initial meetings and all that kind of thing. And I think from this, when I saw this, number one, I needed to do something for my brain. It's feeling a little like Jell-O. And just want to get better at reading the evaluation reports that come across from the school psych.
Okay. Well, welcome, Diana. Wendy Lind. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Lind. I am the learning specialist at Hilltop Montessori School in Vermont. And I do not do the assessing, but I read a lot of beautiful ones and many that come from the Stern Center.
Okay, well, welcome, Wendy.
Thank you.
Megan.
I already went. I can go again though.
Oh, I'm sorry, Megan. Hang on
That's
just a
okay.
second. My things are all out of order. Gwen, can you, are you here? I don't see your.
Yeah, I'm here. I have a cold, so bear with me.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
I'm Gwen Zwickel. I am a literacy specialist in Vermont at an elementary school, K6, and I'm in year 3 of my Orton Gillingham training for my certificate. So I'm in the home stretch. And I had the opportunity to take a course with Melissa this summer, and it really helped my brain really think about assessment and how to interpret assessment. And I'm really interested in sort of continuing thinking about how I can understand what information I'm getting from assessments and what information I'm not getting from assessments beyond those labels, beyond those scores. So yeah, I support classroom teachers, and I have my own tier 2 kids that I work with. So
Okay, Gwen. Well, nice to see you.
nice to see you too.
Kara. Oh, Kara may have stepped away. Christy. Okay, and I'm going to bring us to Brenda Warren. Little bit of a celebrity around here. Brenda's the president of our chapter. Brenda, thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'm Brenda Warren. I've lived in Vermont for 2 years. I came from Wisconsin, and I am not an educator that does any kind of assessment whatsoever. I was on the school board in Wisconsin for 18 years, and I have a real interest in advocating for reading and changing how we teach reading. And so I just like to learn. So here I am.
Welcome, Brenda. Okay, did I miss anybody else who was present? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Terry. I'm sorry,
Sorry.
my camera's not working for some reason. I might try leaving Zoom and joining again, but I
Okay.
teach multilingual learners at Hiawatha Elementary in Essex Junction, Vermont. And I'm also a reading specialist, so I see from time to time I see small groups. Right now I have a tier 3 first grade student who's a multilingual learner and a striving reader. So I'm really interested in learning more about assessments and especially progress monitoring and like others have said, interpreting reports that we see at evaluations.
Okay. Well, welcome, Terry. All right. I am going to talk for a little bit here. And let me take you through just a few things. I thought it might be helpful if I gave you just a little bit of background sort of on the whys and the wherefores of the books. But first, I just want you to know that we're meeting again. We have a few more dates scheduled to look at different segments of the book. It's kind of a lot to capture all in 5 sessions, but we'll sort of pick out highlights and things that that are of particular interest to you. I really want you to feel that the field is wide open for questions and discussions. So, so anyway, we'll be meeting again on February 20th. We are not meeting next week. So let me take you through just sort of a little bit of background information on the book. Here's a picture of me when I was about 20 years old in Moscow, way before I knew I was going to be entering the field of reading. I actually started out as a Slavic linguist. So I know a lot about Russian and Czech and Serbo-Croatian, and that's actually where I learned all about phonology. And it turned out surprisingly that it served me well when I moved into the field of education and reading. I started out as a learning disability specialist, and I worked in southern New Hampshire I had my own sort of as a resource room teacher. And I will just tell you that when I went out into the field, in my first year of teaching, I was really very poorly equipped to either teach or to assess. I had tested all of 2 children. One of them was my own son, and the other was probably a neighbor's kid. And at the time when I was taught to do evaluations, I think we worked primarily just with the Woodcock Johnson. That was pretty much it. And I wasn't really taught about the recommendation part of assessment. I can't even say I was taught about the assessment part of assessment, but for the most part, we were told that if there needed to be a recommendation, we should recommend extra time. So if someone was slow in reading, we recommended extra time. But if someone had poor comprehension, we recommended extra time. We also recommended extra time for kids who couldn't decode. And that was really kind of the extent at the time of my, I hate to say it, of my expertise. And it was only by accident that in the first classroom I had, someone had left a copy of a Project Read manual. And there it was. I started to learn about structured literacy. And anyway, I taught for a few years and ended up moving more into assessment. And I was trained by a wonderful individual, John Willis, who kind of specializes more in cognitive assessment, but knows everything in the world about assessment, and taught me that tests were products that were marketed by companies, and that they could do some things well and some things not so well, but that we had to take a long and hard look at the tests we were using to understand what it is the test purported to measure, what it was actually measuring, and what it would mean for the particular child that we were working with. So I moved into educator training, and I was teaching sort of a basic course in reading, the stages of child, moved into training and assessment. And we would buy textbooks for the course, and I found out that they were pretty much useless, that we would spend a lot of money, right, on these really thick books, and that the amount of pages devoted to reading assessment might be like 3 pages, and that you would read the textbook and you would come away and really not know anything more about actually testing kids than you did before you read the book. And after doing that for a few years, I started just collecting material, and I had a big notebook full of things that I used with my students. And finally, one day sat down and said, I'm going to turn this into a book. The book took me about 3 years to write. It was a 7-day-a-week kind of thing. My husband will tell you I got up every weekend and went into the office and sort of started writing. And if you think that being an author or an author in process is a glamorous thing, I will sort of tell you that the publishing industry has changed a lot over the past several years, particularly with the advent of Amazon. And it can be kind of a lonely endeavor. It's also an expensive endeavor because authors are expected to, there's certain things that we pay for as authors. I had to pay for a lot of resources I didn't have access to. You pay to have an index done for your book. There's all kinds of things. Anyway, the book was published in 2012, and kind of a scary thing. And over time, it has been like steadfast and true, and it has let me teach reading assessment in the way that I feel is really important. I really want people to understand tests as products and not necessarily to be trained in a singular test, but to have that skill set so that you can look at different tests and figure out what it's going to do for you and where it's going to be lacking. It's gotten a fairly positive reception. You put up here the few statistics. It weighs 1.5 pounds, right? It got 4.5 stars from Amazon. And I just sort of went through the other day and I was looking at the things that people were critical of. And some people felt I didn't have enough personal stories, in there. Others felt that it was much too much information to be of any use to anyone. And one singular person felt that the book showed a decided lack of interest in comprehension. And they commented that out of all the, I don't know how many pages in the book, there was only one chapter on reading comprehension. And I always sort of marveled at that because I really felt like the whole thing was about reading comprehension, and that in order to really get to the comprehension part, we really have to understand not just the decoding piece, but the language piece and the cognitive piece, and that all these things together would let us really think long and hard about kids' skills when making meaning from text. So anyway, that's kind of like the brief story of my history and why I felt that book was necessary. I do sort of ponder doing a second edition. And I think if I were to do a second edition, we would certainly update, right, the references to different tests. But more importantly, I think we could have a whole nother chapter on the science of reading and the different things we can learn from medical technology and fMRI studies and that sort of thing. I think that would be kind of fascinating. And that's kind of like, that's kind of my story. I have one other slide here I'll show you really quickly. When I was a graduate student, and this had to do with my dissertation, this is an old Russian manuscript. It's the Gospel according to St. Mark. And if you look really carefully, you can see an M and an A and an R and a K here. This is an old sort of Slavic manuscript. My job at the time as a graduate student and as part of my dissertation was to analyze spelling errors in old Russian manuscripts to see if I could help determine the language of the original document. There was no concept of the author. The only manuscripts they had were translated either pretty much from Greek, but there were thought to be a few sources from Hebrew. And my job was to look and see if the spelling errors would tell us anything about the language of the original document. So I find that kind of interesting because way back in the beginning, I was looking at spelling errors, and now one of my favorite things to do is to look at the spelling errors and what they tell us about children's understanding of rules for sound symbol correspondence and their ability to perceive sounds in words. So on that note, maybe if we just start with, I always find it kind of interesting that, I look back at my own background and I look back at the many team meetings that I've participated in, and I will tell you, I retired in September, so not that I'm still not teaching, but the fact is like I don't feel that we do in our teacher training programs an adequate job of equipping educators to participate in evaluation team meetings and to read those reports, and that we ask people to come together and make these really important decisions without sort of explaining to people the language of assessment or what would be willing to talk about like your own sort of experience in dealing with assessment and the degree to which you're comfortable in dealing with test scores and reports? Whoops, skipped you ahead there. Can we get someone who's willing to talk about assessment?
This is Diana.
Hi, Diana.
When I was doing my master's at Fitchburg State, I was employed at a residential school west of Massachusetts. And one of my responsibilities at that residential school was to do yearly assessments on the KTEA.
Mhm.
And then also, I eventually moved into a different position where I was the assessment coordinator. So I was doing a lot of assessments. And one of the things, as you say, for pre-service teachers, whether it's in special ed or even in a master's program, I think sometimes understanding a test, it's one thing to understand, but it's another thing to administer it and to be there live and in person and to do it over and over and over again. And at one point, while I was at that school, I ended up taking all the new students who were admitted. So I would have a class of 12, but I would do all their intake assessments.
Mhm.
And there was talk at one point of saying, well, why don't we just have one person do all the testing? And I said, in a perfect world, that'd be really nice, but your teachers need to see firsthand when they're doing assessment, what kids can and cannot do. It's
Mhm.
one thing for me to sit there and do it, but then I can't convey that language to you or those observations and that experience of how that child met the task. So really, it's that personal observation that happens during assessments that become really important when we go to write up the results of whatever the numbers show.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah. Any other comments about no takers yet?
I can say that I feel like the culture around reading those reports is changing in our school.
Oh.
In my setting, usually there are psychologists outside of the school that do evaluation reports for special educators. And I would say in the past, people pretty much kind of turned to that last page where the conclusions were, and whatever the psychologist said was pretty much like, okay, they've said yes, no, there's a learning disability here. And maybe some people might poke around in working memory and processing speed a little bit. I believe because of shifts in our laws in Vermont, the
Oh.
teachers in our building are looking much more critically at those reports right now and thinking much more about what do the specific subscores or subtests suggest about what kind of specialized instruction might be needed for students. So that specialized instruction, I think, has turned people's has turned a light on the psychologist report, and there's many more questions about, how did this actually happen? And noticing things like, oh, it says that the student didn't have their glasses that day. How can we qualify a student for special education services when they didn't have their glasses that day? Like, that's a 3-year plan, right? So anyway, I just wanted to say that I feel like there's a shift in the culture, at least in my building, and I think it's partly being driven by changes in our special education laws.
Yes, Vermont has is undergoing with some rather big changes in the way that we identify specific learning disabilities. And it's now going to be pretty much there's such tremendous flexibility in the way that we identify learning disabilities, so as almost to be difficult now to identify a procedure, and it will be really dependent on the particular school district and the particular view of assessment. So many school districts have found that the difficulty involved in bringing in evaluators and writing meaningful reports that actually help instruction has led them to question right? This whole evaluation process, there is going to be a greater focus in the majority of school districts on the background history of students and their educational experience. We're going to be looking much more closely at response to intervention, and are we really doing quality instruction, scientifically based instruction for our students? And the idea is that children who fail to respond, if given high quality instruction, would then be considered for identification as having a special a specific learning disability. But anyway, it's going to be tremendously dependent on the school district that you in and what the local views of assessment are. So big changes in store for us here in Vermont. I think part of me sort of wonders if the fact that we haven't trained people adequately in assessment, that we haven't trained regular education teachers in the language assessment so that they can actually participate in team meetings in a meaningful fashion, that this has led to some of the changes, you know, in the law here. Because a lot of times we go to evaluation team meetings and it's pretty much the school psychologist or the outside psychologist who comes in and does all the talking. And I think the feds, when they envisioned our special education process, really envisioned a process where all the people who have different kinds of knowledge of our students would come together and have these rabble-rousing discussions and disagreements and come to a variety of different conclusions, that people would be contributing in a variety of different ways. But more than that, that everyone who sat at the table would be able to some degree speak the language of assessment, because that would be so important in being able to really come to a conclusion. So, you know, I've heard it say that certain educators would rather go to the dentist, right, and have a tooth pulled than attend another evaluation team meeting, because the fact that we haven't equipped people to participate really in the process makes it kind of sometimes rather a meaningless activity. Any other comments on that? I'm going to take us into
One thing I
Mary.
think is what I found when I started out as an educator and just, you know, reading those reports, they take time. And I was lucky at the school I was at, we received the time. Now that I'm a special educator, I think one of the issues with special educators are getting the time to deal with those reports, but I don't think the regular education team is. And so you end up with an IEP meeting, evaluation meeting that's really kind of in parts. You know, the regular teachers will do their part of what they see in the classroom, but then they don't necessarily talk and add into what's going on with all the evaluations and the determination of services. That's kind of more in the special educators pocket. So we have these pockets of experience and we haven't figured out how to bridge each other's room.
Yeah, I think that we really sort of, one of the things I think Vermont is trying to do is figure out how to integrate that experience so that we come to more meaningful decisions about instruction, but also see a stronger link between the data that we take and the skill sets that we are imparting to kids. And I'm going to use that sort of a little bit as my segue. And once again, I really invite you to like ask questions, even if they're not necessarily on the topics the mini topics that I've picked out for today. But let me start by saying that interestingly enough, I'm going to reach back into my own training. When I was studying to be a special educator, I never had any training in language. And I don't think I really understood in the beginning that listening comprehension and reading comprehension were related in any way, because they were taught as two separate entities. You know, and for example, along the same lines, speaking ability was taught separately from written expression. And I've now come to understand, for example, that if you can't say it, you're never, ever going to be able to put it on paper, right? That oral language is the foundation for everything that we write. And if you can't process sort of language through your ears, if you're not skilled with different aspects of receptive language, then you're probably not going to be very good at discerning meaning from language in print, that it's all very, very much related. The other thing that I didn't really understand was that when we did talk about language, we kind of assigned it to the speech and language pathologist. Well, this is the thing that the SLP does. This is her specialty. And during those meetings, we would all turn to the SLP so that she could, or he could impart their wisdom about language without ever understanding that no matter what it was we were teaching, that we were involved in language usage, whether it be about reading or whether it be about, earth science or whether it be about history or social studies and so forth, that it was all about language. And that language, the study of language, wasn't just about the grammar, that the study of language is about this really important aspect of cognition. And that, let me just say, jump to kind of the end here, it's really hard to think good quality thoughts if you don't have language with which to do it. That words are the building blocks of thinking good thoughts. And being skilled in the realm of syntax, for example, the understanding of how it is we chunk words into meaningful units, is really critical, once again, for being able to think clear and cogent thoughts and relate two facts, ideas, or concepts together, right? So it is those compound sentences and those complex sentences which let us take two thoughts and put them together. I always think of a Venn diagram, put them together in some way. And that those two skills, I'm not even going through the rest of the structure of language, are really going to be critical, not just for your understanding of language, right? And taking in language for your ears, but going to be really important for reading comprehension, going to be really important for thinking on paper. And that's really what written expression is all about, thinking on paper. So I always try to remind myself that language is this really important form of cognition, and that when we work with children, we are wading in deep, right, into that pool of language or structured literacy. So let me take you a little bit through my view of assessment, and feel free to kind of push back on it. Feel free to say, well, this is what we do, but we don't, this is, so I have found that theoretical views of reading have been really helpful to me in when I think about designing an assessment. So how do we know that when we decide to test a kid, that we are doing it thoroughly, and that we are really looking at a lot of those underlying skills, which are going to be so important either for decoding or for the comprehension part. And I come back to the simple view, and it's kind of amazing. So as someone who has a bit of longevity in the field now, I've been doing this for about, since the early 1990s. The simple view has kind of come and gone in popularity. Let me just tell you that when it came out in 1986, it was a time in the field where the focus was on how we make meaning from print. So there was a lot of interest in research in the area of vocabulary. There was a lot of interest in not in syntax, but in like inferential thinking and how it is that we draw good conclusions, and also in aspects of like organization and how it is that we organize our thoughts. And that was the primary focus. And when the simple view of reading came out, what Goff and Tumner had to say was that reading comprehension consists of skill in two domains, one of which is decoding, which is kind of everything from phonological processing, word identification, word ITAC, all the way up through reading fluency, and what they called linguistic comprehension. And you can think about linguistic comprehension as synonyms for it would be receptive language. Another synonym for it could be listening comprehension. That's probably a good one. When I think about this piece, I think about all of the intellectual power that we bring to make meaning from a text. So I'm thinking not only about our language skills, our verbal abilities, I'm also thinking about our spatial skills and our working memory and our processing speed, all of that, because it is our spatial thinking system, which we don't talk about all that much, which helps us to organize all this verbal stuff that we know. So our spatial thinking system helps us to discern what's important from what's not. It helps us to prioritize the kinds of knowledge we take in. It helps us to think things through with logic and with sequence. So I think about this so-called linguistic comprehension thing as really huge in incorporating all of our different thinking abilities. Anyway, Goff and Tumner basically said that in reading comprehension consisted of skill in both domains, this decoding domain and this linguistic comprehension. And I'm just going to stop here and ask if there's any questions or anything anyone would like to say before I move on.
I have a question about
Yes.
the simple view. Nell Duke's work around the not so simple and her bridging processes. It doesn't seem to have gained a lot of traction. It still seems that most people talk about the simple view. And I'm just curious about what, I mean, it seems like there's interesting research that it's maybe not fully fleshed out yet, but I'm just curious about that and whether that's where that might even show up in assessment. I'm just curious about that whole metacognitive piece
The whole,
reading and how we might come to assess that.
the metacognitive piece. So by this, you mean awareness of, so
Well, I think, well, at least my understanding of what that piece was like when how does readers realize when it's not making sense?
oh, okay. And that's a really, okay, so how do we, so our ability, when we engage in a task, part of our focus and attention is directed at exactly what we are doing to accomplish that task. And that hopefully we have enough of our working memory left over so that we can also look at the quality of what we're doing as we are doing it. And with respect to reading comprehension, that might involve having enough awareness to know when things are going off track or to know when things are not making sense. And I guess I'm trying to think about how we would, I'm thinking about the assessment piece of this and whether we have tools out there that would help us look at that metacognitive piece, like can we discern when we're going off track? And I don't know of anything that's out there right now. I think there was a lot that was, I'm going to say this really carefully, and give me a chance to put it out there and then take it back a little bit, that there was a lot that was not included in the simple view because what they were trying to do was capture the domains that were specific to reading. And I think in one of their more recent responses, they wrote that they didn't include things like executive function, which in part would capture this metacognitive ability because they felt that was not unique to reading. And what I'm going to say to you is that certainly these skills, all of our decoding skills and our language skills, exist in this, what I call a sea of executive function, those underlying processes that help us act in a goal-directed manner that help us initiate and maintain our attention, that help us switch processes, that help us bring our task to a meaningful conclusion, right? And be mindful of the quality with which we're doing that task. So I don't know, Michael, that I've addressed, sometimes I get myself off task. I don't know that I've addressed your ultimate question here. I will say sometimes observationally, when we work with kids, it becomes real clear to us as observers when kids understand that they are going off track. And then sometimes we have experiences with children who are just sort of oblivious to the fact that what they are understanding is making no sense at all. Other comments, anything else? Okay. So just to recap a little bit, simple view of reading focuses on skill in 2 domains that make it possible to understand text. And I think about that decoding piece as the access piece, right? It's the on-ramp so that we then can discern meaning from text, which here is what they referred to as linguistic comprehension. So that brings me to how I think about constructing a reading evaluation. And I call this a focused reading evaluation because sometimes, and you guys know, our evaluations are much bigger in scope. It really depends on the nature of the referral questions, what those specific questions are. If the question is this a specific learning disability, then we're probably going to be doing a much bigger evaluation with a cognitive component to it. But for our purposes here, and now let's kind of talk about what like a focused reading dyslexia evaluation would be. So I'm just looking, I'm wondering how helpful the subtests are that it's just separate conform decision conjunctive with reading specific. We'll come back to this, Beth Ann. So here's my vision, sort of. I used to call this a top-down approach, and then my assistant informed me it wasn't top-down at all. It was really left to right. But anyway, I always think about beginning with comprehension tasks. And I'm just going to say, out of all the things that we do in an evaluation, I've always found this to be the least interesting, the least informative. And I always felt like when I was starting out, I used to like test comprehension, and I always come away with it feeling like a little dissatisfied. In the beginning, I just sort of didn't understand why. And it was because it never helped me go anywhere with reading, and it never helped me make like decisions about instruction. That when kids did well, that was all well and good, you know, very nice. But when kids did poorly, it never explained to me the whys and wherefores, and it never really led me to, once again, to making instructions about, to making decisions about how it is we should teach this kid. If we follow along with the simple view, we want to be sure, like in order to answer these questions, that we are really looking at the 2 domains. And here I've labeled them a little bit differently. You can see that I have a fluency domain, and you can see that I have a listening comprehension domain. And let's just start with reading fluency. So when comprehension is iffy, we want to know a little bit more about why. And in a top-down approach, we're going to begin with measures of reading fluency. And if those come up as problematic or rather iffy, we're going to drop down a level, and we're going to look at word recognition, right? The ability to recognize real words, both regular and irregular. We're going to look at decoding with nonsense words. And let me just tell you that nonsense words are like, I'm going to say God's gift to the assessment world, because they are just a wonderful way of looking at the degree to which children have internalized rules for sound symbol correspondence and phonics and morphemes, like all that good stuff. and whether they can apply those associations to words they've never seen before. And historically, I'm just feel the need to go there. I'm always interested in the backstory. Nonsense words have always been really controversial because by definition, they lack meaning. And there's certain like whole language school of thinking would ask, well, why on earth would you make children do anything that lacked meaning with respect to reading, that's not going to take you anywhere good. I used to hear stories that children would be extremely frustrated by nonsense words, become angry over being asked to decode words that had no meaning. It's never really been my experience. I have found that nonsense words have been uniquely helpful, once again, in understanding kids' mastery of phonics skills and whether they can apply them to words they've never seen before. I often see reading evaluations that don't have a spelling component. And I'm just going to say to you that, we think about spelling as being like the other side of the word recognition coin. It's not exactly an opposite because it's a graphomotor skill, like it goes through the hand. But the fact is that spelling often hangs together score-wise with word recognition and or decoding. And spelling provides a wonderful window into how it is, once again, the degree to which kids understand their rules of phonics, but more deeply, it provides a window into the degree to which kids can perceive sounds in words. And oftentimes, the things that we see on a decoding test are mirrored by the things that we see on a spelling test. And as an evaluator, we always like to have multiple sources of information. And it's really nice when the skill set for word recognition and decoding aligns with spelling, because then we have some more confirmation of the fact that we're getting good data, and it's all can be really helpful. So when these things are below standard, not where we would hope they would be, we're going to want to look deeply. And we're then going to dive into the skills that fall under that phonological umbrella. So that phonological processor's ability to do its job. And we're going to look at phonological memory, right? The ability to hold speech sounds in memory, or let me say more precisely, the ability to hold like language-based information in memory. And we're also going to look at issues related to phonological awareness, or more precisely, phonemic awareness. And the difference is that phonological awareness is about generalized sound patterns in words. Phonemic awareness is about individual speech sounds in words. And that's really where it's at, because it's when kids have an awareness of individual speech sounds and words that they can link those speech sounds to letter symbols, and that sets us off on our pathway to becoming fluent readers. So we're going to look at all of those skills. We're going to look at something called rapid naming, which is kind of like, I often liken it to sort of processing speed on a computer. And in general, having more speed is better than being kind of slow and inefficient and inaccurate. And rapid naming involves the ability to name color sequences or familiar objects, or in the case of reading, letters and numbers quickly and with ease, because if we can do that, it suggests that we have the internal machinery to eventually read with fluency, and that's a really good thing. Let me just say that we know a lot more about remediating kids with deficits in phonological awareness than we do kids with rapid naming deficits. It just seems that rapid naming is kind of a more complex entity. And when it breaks down, we're not entirely sure exactly where it's breaking down. So it's been difficult to figure out a fix. aside from providing kids with extra practice so that they can automatize all those lower level skills as a foundation for reading with fluency. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to kind of move myself on because we could spend a whole lot of time talking about rapid naming. And if you want to talk about it more, we certainly can come back to it. The other thing that I discovered was worthwhile doing was looking at alphabet knowledge. And we think about alphabet knowledge and we kind of, our brains immediately go to really young kids, kids in kindergarten, kids in first grade. I started asking all of my students to write the alphabet for me, even those in middle school and high school. And I have to say, I am still kind of taken aback when I have middle school and high school students who aren't able to write their alphabet with 100% accuracy completely and in the correct sequence. And what I often do when I'm writing a report is I take a picture of that written alphabet and I put it right in the report because it's sort of that pictures, speak 1,000 words kind of thing. And to show people that the magnitude of the problem for many of our older students, a problem that began when they were all the way back in kindergarten and has still not been addressed in these middle school and high school students. And it's like, of course, they're struggling with reading. And of course, they're struggling with written expression because they never, ever mastered the 26 letters of the alphabet, and you just need them all, So anyway, I would say that too, and just to bring us back to really young kids, the alphabet, the knowledge of the alphabet is a huge predictor of who's going to learn to read and who's not. And if you could probably do one thing at the kindergarten level is I would make kids recite their alphabet and I would make them show me in first grade that they could write the alphabet, because it turns out that not only is knowledge of the alphabet a huge predictor of reading ability, the ability to write the alphabet in the first grade is a huge predictor of writing ability. And if you think about it, once again, it just really makes sense that in order to express our thoughts on paper, we have to know those 26 letters of the alphabet. Like nothing short of that will do. So I'm going to just stop here and ask if there are questions, things that people do, people things that don't do on that fluency side of things. Probably most of you who are doing assessment are assessing are assessing like phonological processes and word recognition, decoding and fluency. But let's talk about this listening comprehension piece, because I think that listening comprehension in some ways it's counterintuitive. Like, why would you want to include listening comprehension in an evaluation of skill with language and print? I mean, it's sort of a huge question. And the fact is that listening comprehension speaks to a child's potential for reading comprehension, presuming that they can read all the words. And let me just say that in a different way. That from a score perspective, a child's listening ability should pretty much equal their reading comprehension skill. The two should come out the same if a child truly has access to language and print. And I'm gonna talk about this chart a little bit, and then I have another chart that I want to show you, which will kind of look at it in a different way. But the ability to process the language that we take in through our ears is that foundation skill for processing language in print, presuming that we can read all the words. So listening comprehension, when kids score well, like we're happy, that means like really good potential for reading comprehension. When kids score poorly, we have to ask that question again, like, what's going on here? Why is it problematic? And certainly sometimes it's due to challenges in executive function, challenges with attention, challenges with concentration, challenges with working memory, the ability to hold all that stuff that's coming in on your working memory platter and then process it all, right? And you won't see that in my chart because I'm not going into the realm of executive function. But sometimes challenges with listening comprehension are due to challenges with the structure of language. It could be that our student has a minimal vocabulary, never really developed their vocabulary. And as I say, words are the foundation skills for thinking good thoughts. It's hard to think good thoughts if you don't have a good vocabulary and you don't have a lot of words at your disposal and you don't understand fine differences in the meaning of words. Sometimes the issue is not in the vocabulary, however, sometimes it's in this realm of syntax. And syntax has been an area that's really been neglected in our field. I think so many years ago, it got kind of a bad name because people thought about syntax as a synonym for grammar. And it was decided at some point that we couldn't teach grammar, or at least we didn't teach it very well, and that the whole thing was kind of meaningless and boring to begin with. So syntax is actually that understanding or the ability to group words into meaningful units, such as phrases or clauses. So for some kids, they have the words, but their barrier to comprehension actually occurs at the sentence level because they can't do this chunking of words into meaningful units. And if you can't chunk things into meaningful units, then it's really hard to process. And you know how we've all been trained in special education, like chunking is this really good thing? Well, it works when we're processing language. So imagine if I give you a really long sentence with a lot of phrases and clauses and you're not able to chunk it, then you have to process it in terms of each word individually. And all those individual words, maybe there's 15 of them, have to like make their way onto your working memory platter. And that's really quite burdensome. That's really quite difficult. But if we can chunk those words into a few phrases and clauses, we can handle them as meaningful units. It's less work for our working memory to do, and we can process it more easily. So anyway, sometimes that listening barrier like occurs at the sentence level. And it occurs when kids have difficulty chunking those words into those meaningful units. Sometimes we're going to move down my list. We're more interested in issues related to pragmatics and semantics. So now you might be thinking pragmatics, oh, kids on the spectrum, children who maybe are able to, are maybe adept at using language grammatically, like their speech is technically correct, but they may be off in their style and they may have difficulty understanding how it is that they can modify their language usage in order to achieve their needs, wants, and desires. So you may wonder what that has to do with reading comprehension, but if we were reading a novel with characters that had certain, performing certain actions and were motivated to do certain things, then having an understanding of pragmatics would help you understand why it is people do the things they do and why it is they say the things that they say. And that would be really important for reading comprehension. Sometimes our kids have difficulty with semantics, for example, understanding that words have multiple meanings and that meaning is dependent upon a word's usage at any given moment, given its context. And you can imagine, like we do a lot of work as educators with vocabulary, so you can imagine how important this would be for reading comprehension. And then my last area is kind of background knowledge and inferencing. We don't really have a great way of measuring background knowledge. It kind of gets lumped in. We kind of use vocabulary as a proxy for background knowledge. But we do have ways of measuring inferential thinking, because that ability to take in information and to draw good conclusions is really key. And we have a lot of our students who are not necessarily able to read between the lines and don't know that the meaning that's there, that's right on the surface, is not all there is to that particular test. So we have some oral language tests that let us look at inferential thinking skills. And that's a really nice piece to look at when we want to talk about reading comprehension. So I'm just going to stop for a moment because I'm talking a whole lot. Questions, things you want to talk about? This is really for you guys today. Any questions? All right, let me just back up and feel free once again to stop me and to interrupt me. So a comprehensive reading evaluation, if we truly want to look at all the areas that support reading comprehension, is going to involve work with the code, right? As well as language skill. Now, let me show you what happens when we integrate listening comprehension into our evaluation. We can come up with, I have 4 different profiles here. So my first profile is when listening is strong and reading comprehension is strong. For the most part, I think we can presume that we have a skilled reader. Remember I said to you that when decoding skills are well developed, when children really have access, their reading comprehension should be comparable to their listening. We now have a skilled reader. If this child has been referred for evaluation, we probably would want to go back, take a good look at those referral questions, go back and talk to those educators and talk to those parents to determine whether there would be a need for further testing. Sometimes we get a different profile. We get kids who are strong listeners, but have a weakness in reading comprehension. And I would ask you at this point to volunteer and tell me what this profile is, but I put it there for you already. So this is our classic dyslexic profile. And I don't want to give you the impression that that dyslexic profile, which we can talk about another time, is the same in all kids, because there's tremendous variation. I don't know if there's tremendous variation, but I'm going to say it that way. There's variation in children who are dyslexic. So in this particular case, this listening comprehension is speaking to this child's potential for reading comprehension. And I've always found that like incorporating listening into a reading eval was kind of a nice thing to do, because it was oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes a bit of good news for parents. It's like, we're talking about all these weaknesses today, but let me speak to you about your child's receptive language skill, about your child's knowledge of the world, because once we teach him or her to read the words, she's going to be doing just fine. So with these students, what is it that we do? We're going to rule out, like we've done here, challenges with receptive language. And we're going to look at reading fluency. We're going to look at word recognition of real words, both regular and irregular. We're going to look at those nonsense word decoding skills. We're going to delve into that phonological processor and learn as much as we can about that. And maybe we're going to explore other areas of cognition depending on the referral questions. Now I'm going to have you drop down to the bottom here, because sometimes we get like this converse profile. We get weak listening and we get strong reading comprehension. And I'm just going to tell you, like learning about assessment is sort of a process. And this profile just bothered me for years and years and years, because it's kind of counterintuitive. Like, how could it be that reading comprehension would be really strong and listening comprehension could be weak? The answer is that it will either lie in issues related to hearing, right? And we always need, I should have said at the beginning, we always need to check vision and hearing. Or it could be found in issues related to executive function, right? To attention again, to that working memory piece, that cognitive platter where we take everything in. And in these cases, we're going to want to take another look, a deeper look at executive function and attention. Because these are children who are better equipped to take in language in its permanent form than they are to deal with language that's fleeting. So just think for a moment about the difference between taking in language on paper, it's permanent, it's there for forever, versus taking in language through your ears where you have to capture it as it goes by. And if you don't get it in that any given moment, it is gone and impossible to get again. Think about what happens when someone gives you a phone number and you don't catch all the digits, right? Unless they give it to you again, you have no way of capturing that information again. So this is kind of a unique population, right? Better equipped to deal with language in print than they are language through listening. Things you want to talk about, things you want to.
Melissa, I'm curious about, this seems like you're coming at it from the perspective of doing sort of like a special education evaluation.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the way you're thinking about comprehension here as opposed to the way that I tend to talk about comprehension with my teachers, which is about how students are making meaning from text. Oh, that text complexity plays in that, and the reader and task, that whole RAND stuff plays into it. And how I'm just trying to bridge the meaning of it. I'm curious about how you're talking about comprehension or how you're thinking about comprehension when you talk about these things.
Let me try just coming at it from a slightly different angle. So when I was originally trained as a special educator, like I said, no one ever talked to me about language. It was remarkably absent from all those classes that I attended, but we did talk a lot about, text complexity and the clarity of text. There was something many, many years ago that we used to talk about considerate text. We really meant text that was well written, that would facilitate comprehension. We talked a lot about strategies to improve reading comprehension. And I'm going to put this out there and then I'm going to take it back a little bit, because it's like sometimes I have to kind of say things and then talk around it. It's like in the evaluation world, we can never say anything simply. We always have to have a million qualifiers and so forth. So I was trained in the instruction of a lot of different reading strategies. There is research on this question of strategy instruction, right? This idea of previewing text, reviewing text, that sort of thing, versus language instruction. And I'm going to say that there's some research that says we have to be, let me say it this way, really careful that we can understand the difference between the two, because no instruction in strategies will help a child who's struggling with the language. So I think about it sort of in layers. So kids have to be able to decode. They then have to be able to process that language. And they then have to be able to use their strategies so that they can begin to understand the things that are really important versus the things that are not, so that they can learn to like prioritize, so that they can organize that information in their heads, so that they can integrate it into like long-term memory and make it available to them in the future. I think that in terms of the test industry, we don't have tests that would let us look at passages of varying complexities. And as I say that, I'm trying to figure out exactly what that would mean and what that kind of test would look like, because the way that our reading comprehension tests are structured is that we move typically from shorter passages to longer passages. We have, as children age, we have increasing numbers of fewer numbers of concrete questions and increasing numbers of inferential questions, because we know that's a skill that increases with age. We have increasing vocabulary demands, and we probably have, I'm going to say, longer sentences, because that's sort of a, in terms of like readability formulas look at two different factors. They look at the predominance of multisyllable words, and they look at the average length, number of words in sentences. They look at those two things. So I don't know that. So complexity to me means higher vocabulary burden, longer sentences, probably longer paragraphs. It also kind of suggests to me content that's more exotic. Someone else wanna? Sometimes I miss the point, Michael. I apologize if I didn't, if I didn't address exactly what you were speaking about. But it may well be sort of a different look at what we typically think of as reading comprehension. Additional thoughts, additional questions? You guys all seem very content to listen to me today. I hope that's okay. So let me continue. So these, anyway, are the 4 profiles that we can get by contrasting listening and reading. And let me just go back and say that, you know, listening is now typically part of many of the batteries that we use. Like you'll find both the Kaufman test of educational achievement is set up so that if we want to, we can contrast listening with reading comprehension and see if there's a significant difference. The Wechsler individual achievement test will also let us contrast listening and reading. The Woodcock-Johnson sort of has a different view of what listening comprehension is. So they assess it with different kinds of skills. It doesn't match up quite so nicely, but that we're seeing, I think, the importance of the role of oral language as a foundation for reading comprehension now being adopted by the test industry, and anyway, we have a more and more capacity to do that. Sometimes there are some tests out there. There's something called the OPUS, the Oral Passage Understanding Scale, which is like, I'll just tell you, it's one of my favorite measures of listening, and let me explain to you why I like it. The language, in contrast to many measures of listening skill, is very bookish. So it's like you're reading to kids from books, from stories of increasing complexity. We read a passage to them and we ask a series of questions. I really like the questions because a lot of them delve into that realm of inferential thinking skills and the conclusions that kids can draw based upon what they hear. And it comes with kind of a handy dandy chart so that you can look at the specific area realm of inferential thinking to kind of identify what this particular child is able to do really well and what he or she is struggling with. There are other measures of language skill that there's something called the OWLS, the oral and written language scale, that lets us look at listening and contrast it to reading comprehension. It lets us look at speaking and contrast it to written expression. I mean, you can do contrast galore. But an interesting thing about this particular test is it's designed with the structure of language in mind. So for every task a child has to perform, that task is categorized in terms of, is this a question that deals with vocabulary? Is this a question that deals with sentence structure? Is this a question that deals with inferential thinking skills? It's kind of becomes a foundation, it becomes a diagnostic tool. And I'm not telling you it's the be all and end all for speech and language testing. We would never want to say that. If we were really interested in overall language testing, then we really should talk to our friendly SLP, right? And see what recommendations they would make. But anyway, we have more and more vehicles now to really kind of take a look at this listening versus reading comprehension. And the other thing I wanted to say is this contrast is not new, that in our reading, the term has just escaped me, I want to say old-fashioned reading inventories that have been around forever. A lot of them let us look at the difference between listening and reading comprehension. So a lot of these older reading inventories have a listening component and they have a reading comprehension component, which may well be worthwhile because it's nice to understand a child's capacity for listening in contrast to their child's capacity for actual reading comprehension. That's a really good thing. So, questions, thoughts? This is really kind of, I'm just going to say, we're talking about a lot of stuff here. It's a lot. Yes.
Could you repeat the name of the first listening comprehension assessment? Did you say it was called the OPUS?
The OPUS, OPUS, the Oral Passage Understanding Scale.
Okay.
It's actually a companion test designed to go with the oral and written language scales, which you don't have to have. But like I say, the OPUS is just sort of a really interesting way of doing listening comprehension with a specific focus on inferential thinking, which is so important to reading comprehension. And we don't have really many measures that focus on inferential thinking. And I just want to say again too, so sometimes we administer kids these tests of reading comprehension that purport to look at both literal understanding and the ability to think inferentially. But when kids get these questions wrong, we have to be really sure that we understand why they're getting them wrong, because sometimes the answer might be, we didn't answer this inferential question because we're not good at inferential thinking. But sometimes the answer is, we didn't answer that inferential thinking question because we couldn't read the words to begin with, or because we couldn't read the words quickly enough, right, in order to process that, or we didn't have the vocabulary to even get to the inferential thinking part, or we didn't have the syntax to get to the inferential thinking part. And that is really why we want to look at, right, the full range of skills so that we can really understand like what is going awry when we look at poor scores on a comprehension test. Questions? If not, I will take you a little bit further in the 10 minutes that we have. Okay. So these first couple of chapters in the book deal kind of with language development, which is so critical, right? In terms of reading comprehension. And let me tell you that it was Hollis Scarborough who said that she kind of said, yeah, this phonological awareness thing is really important, but it's not the only thing that's highly predictive of future performance of kids as readers. And she sort of shook her finger at us and sort of said, there are other things in the realm of language that are really predictive too. So let me just start this by saying that when children have delays in their language developmental milestones, that should be a red flag to us in the very, very beginning that these children are at risk for challenges with reading comprehension and reading decoding, both of them, because it turns out that having a well-developed vocabulary is a precursor to becoming phonemically aware. I'm going to say that one more time because it's such a cool thing. Having a well-developed vocabulary is a precursor, like having a lot of words stuffed in your head is a precursor to becoming phonemically aware. So when we look at these background histories, we really want to kind of think like, oh my goodness, language delay. We should be a little bit more careful and a little bit alert to make sure that this child is meeting their milestones, right, in kindergarten and first grade. So the fact is that language develops in stages, right? Kids speak in single words when they're one. They speak in like 2-word units when they're 2, that the number of words syntactically matches their age, like up until they reach about 7 years old. We hope that those really early years are enhanced. We hope that parents are talking to their kids a lot. We hope they're reading to them a lot. And I'm just going to say, it's not just about exposure to good literature. It's about developing the vocabulary, developing that command of syntax, right? And also developing those attention and concentration skills, because when kids enter elementary school, language changes, the demands on language change. And instead of going through it, instead of an environment where it's turn taking and give and take, and my mom says something and I talk, and then she says something back, right? With lots of opportunities for conversational repair. When kids enter the classroom, they now have to process discourse. They now have to process what I call lengthy language, right? And processing of lengthy language is another foundation skill for reading comprehension. So kids have developed that sustained attention. They have to know how it is. They have to have that metacognitive skill to know when a conversation is going awry and they need to step in and fix it in some way. Okay? We hope that they have a decent vocabulary. We hope that they can express themselves in the past tense, in the present tense, and the future tense. So their conversations, so what they say is not always tied to something in the moment. So we hope that they have all those good things in place, because that is their foundation for participating, for learning in the classroom, and it becomes their foundation for, as I said, for reading conversation. Now I want to show you, we have just a few minutes. I just want to show you something here. Any opinion on the map? I'm sorry, I'm looking on the, I don't give the map. So I'm going to stay away from those questions, and maybe someone else we can put that on the agenda for next time. But let me show you something really quick. So this is what I call my minute test score lesson. All right. And all I need you to see here is that this is our bell curve. We're looking at a scoring system called Stay Nines. It's a, see the Stay Nine? It's a scale of 1 to 9. anything between 4 and 6 kind of captures that average range. Although a kid who gets a 4 is not really very similar to a kid who gets a 6. But anyway, scale of 1 to 9, 5 is smack dab average. Everything between 4 and 6 is kind of in the average range. So now let me show you like my example here. So we're testing Sasha. We given Sasha a listening comprehension test and a reading comprehension test. Listening comprehension is a 6. Reading comprehension is 3. Explain to me why we would see this. Where should your head be going when you see this kind of difference in scores, this pattern of scores? Anyone want to venture?
I'm going to guess for Sasha, it's dyslexia. I mean, has the oral language skills, but she doesn't have the decoding skills.
Okay, Marion, that would be a very reasonable guess, and she may or may not be dyslexic, but yes, we know that the simple view is telling us, right, that her listening is strong. Her reading comprehension is awry. So where is the problem probably located? Probably located with her decoding skills, right? So it's her lack of access that's undermining her reading comprehension here. Now, take a look at this one. So Masha has a listening comprehension, a score of a 3, and a reading comprehension of 3. So tell me where you think the whole focus here, right, is like to understand where we would go instructionally. What is this saying to us? Where should our heads go? What do we want to know more about?
I'd want to know more of what the cognitive profile,
Okay.
does she have a really low IQ? And then maybe this for her, is balanced. Again, rule out that there is a problem with hearing, something like that.
Okay, so you've touched upon a couple of things. So we could be looking at a problem with hearing. We could be looking at a child who's kind of low overall cognitively. Any other thoughts? I kind of want to know, I want to know more about her language skill in general. I want to know where that 3 is coming from. Her listening is really poor. Like, what is her vocabulary like? Is she skilled with syntax? Is she a really like concrete individual, possibly with broader low IQ scores, who's fairly like she's concrete in nature, so she struggles with abstract and figurative expressions, and she struggles to think inferentially. All of those things that I want to know. What else do I need to know about her? So all of that stuff, right, is going to feed into that language path for improving her reading skill. But what do we also need to know? I call this profile diagnostically murky. So we know her listening is poor. We need to know more. Oh, it could be EF. Yes, Wendy, it certainly could be. But in that reading comprehension could be solely due to her poor receptive language skill. That reading comprehension score could also reflect challenges in decoding as well. So there's a lot that we don't know about this kid, because we don't know where that 3 in reading comprehension is coming from. It's logical to assume that part of it's coming from poor receptive language skill, but we have no information here about her decoding. And in order to turn Masha into a competent reader, we need to be sure that we are addressing both sides of that simple view, both her receptive language skill and her reading decoding. Questions? So if there are no questions, it is now 5:30. We've come to kind of the end of this time today. We're going to be looking at the next chunk of chapters. If you look at the literature you'll see exactly what chapters we're going to be doing. I will prepare something similar. You are more than welcome to bring up topics of things that interest you, discussions of tests that I may or may not be able to address. But anyway, I look forward to seeing you all in about 2 weeks. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. So on that note, thank you for joining me. I really, guess it's kind of fun. So anyway, I will see you in about 2 weeks. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Melissa.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.